There are roughly 60 Wimpys left in Britain. There used to be more than 500. At its peak in the early 1970s, Wimpy was the burger chain, the only one most British people had ever been to. It wasn't a drive-through, it wasn't a counter queue, it was a sit-down restaurant on the high street, with a waitress, a plate, a knife and fork, and a plastic tomato full of ketchup on every table. You could have a cup of tea with your burger, you could have pudding afterwards. The whole thing felt less like fast food and more like a British cafe that happened to serve hamburgers. Then McDonald's arrived in Woolwich in 1974. It brought paper wrappers, counter service, and a system built entirely around speed. Within 2 decades, the high street had chosen. This is the story of what Wimpy was, how it worked, and why Britain moved on. Start with the table. Not the brand, not the logo, not the corporate history. The table, because that's what made Wimpy different from everything that came after. And it's what most people remember first. You walked in off the high street, and it was always the high street. Wedged between Woolworths and the chemist, or tucked beside the Odeon, or sharing a wall with the building society, and someone showed you to a seat. A proper seat, at a proper table, with a laminated menu propped between the salt cellar and the sauce bottles, and a set of cutlery wrapped in a paper napkin. You didn't queue at a counter, you didn't shuffle along a rail balancing a plastic tray. You sat down the way you'd sit down at a cafe or a tea shop, the way your mom had sat down at a Lyons corner house a generation before, and somebody came to you. That somebody was almost always a woman. She'd appear at the table within a minute or two, sooner if it was quiet, a little longer if the lunchtime rush had come in all at once, and she'd take your order with a pencil and a pad, the way waitresses had been doing in Lyons tea shops for decades before anyone in Britain had heard the word hamburger. Quick, practiced, efficient, she'd disappear towards the kitchen hatch, have a word with the grill cook, maybe a half shout over the noise of the extractor fan, and a few minutes later she'd be back with a plate. Not a box, not a paper wrapper with a logo on it. A plate, warm from the kitchen, with a burger and chips and fried onions turning dark and sweet at the edges, and a little garnish of lettuce and sliced tomato that nobody particularly wanted but everybody expected. Because a meal without garnish wasn't a proper meal. Not in Britain, not then. There'd be a plastic tomato on the table. You remember the plastic tomato. Red, slightly sticky around the cap, shaped like the fruit but holding ketchup, and it always, always dribbled a thin red line when you set it back down. There'd be a bottle of brown sauce for the chips, and a metal stand with paper napkins, and a cup of tea if you'd asked for one, which most people did, because this was Britain and tea came with everything. The cup sat in its saucer with a teaspoon alongside it, and the bag was still in because that's how they did it. And you fished it out yourself and left it on the saucer in a small brown puddle. The smell hit you before the food arrived, and it started the moment you opened the door. Hot fat from the flat-top grill, a thick, savory warmth that hung in the air like a curtain, onions browning and softening in their own juices, going from sharp to sweet as they cooked down. The faint, sugary warmth of milkshake syrup from the machine behind the counter, mixing with the sharper, more bitter smell of coffee from the percolator that sat on the back shelf and was rarely off. And underneath it all, persistent and oddly comforting, the clean chemical tang of whatever they used to wipe the formica tables between customers. A smell that lodged in the memory the way school corridor polish or swimming pool chlorine does, not because it was pleasant exactly, but because it was always there, and the brain filed it under this place. We tell the stories of what Britain built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't trying to be glamorous. But it was warm, it was brisk, and for the better part of 2 decades it was as much a part of the British high street as the post office, the Woolworths pick and mix counter, and the bus stop outside. That was Wimpy. And to understand what it was, really understand it, as a workplace and as a piece of British life, you have to understand the world it grew out of. The first British Wimpy opened in 1954 inside a Lyons corner house. That detail matters more than it might seem at first, because it explains everything about the kind of burger restaurant Britain actually got. J. Lyons and Company was not a burger company. It was not American. It had no interest in drive-ins or car hops or chrome stools. Lyons was the backbone of British mass catering. Tea shops, corner houses, hotel dining rooms, factory canteens, outdoor catering, ice cream. The company had been feeding ordinary people quickly and respectably since the 1890s, and by the mid 20th century it operated on a scale that most people today would find surprising. Its famous nippies, waitresses in crisp black and white uniforms who moved through the corner house dining rooms with quiet, practiced speed. Trays balanced, orders memorized, smiles in place, had become a kind of national institution. The nippy wasn't fast food in any modern sense. She was fast enough, polite, capable, impeccably turned out, and very, very British. So when Lyons licensed the Wimpy name from an American brand and installed it inside its existing catering empire, the hamburger didn't arrive in Britain as it existed in America. It arrived domesticated, tamed, not teenage drive-in chaos with car hops and neon signs and rock and roll on the jukebox. Something quieter, more mannered, halfway between a cafe, a tea shop, and a burger parlor. The burger had crossed the Atlantic, but Lyons had wiped its feet at the door and given it a knife and fork. Understanding what went on inside a Wimpy bar means understanding the work, because the work is what made the experience possible. A shift began well before the first customer walked in. Opening meant lighting the grills and waiting for the flat top to come up to temperature. A slow, patient process, the metal ticking as it heated, the first thin film of oil beginning to shimmer. It meant slicing onions, on enough to fill a container that would last through the morning rush and into the early afternoon. It meant preparing chips, peeling, cutting, blanching, and storing them ready for the fryer. It meant setting out crockery, plates stacked by the hatch, saucers and cups for tea and coffee, side plates for the desserts, laying cutlery at each place setting, knife, fork, teaspoon, paper napkin, filling the sauce bottles and checking they weren't clogged at the nozzle, testing the milkshake machine, which had temperamental days, stocking the tea and coffee station, tea bags, sugar, milk jugs, clean spoons, and making sure the dessert counter was presentable, because the desserts were not an afterthought. They were part of what made Wimpy feel like a proper meal, rather than a snack you bolted on the move. And those desserts had real pull. Swine the Brown Derby, a dome of vanilla ice cream coated in warm chocolate sauce, sitting in a small dish like a sweet dark monument, was priced at around 17 pence in the early 1970s. Not much, even then, but enough to make a child's eyes go wide and to make adults order one with the quiet, slightly sheepish pleasure of someone who knows it's indulgent and doesn't care. The Knickerbocker glory came layered in a tall glass. Ice cream, fruit, sauce, cream, another layer of ice cream, more sauce, and a fan wafer sticking out the top like a small edible flag. Children began lobbying for them before the main course had arrived, because they understood, instinctively, strategically, that once the word Knickerbocker was hanging in the air, refusal became harder. The smart ones started asking while their parents were still reading the menu. And then there was the signature item, the one that nobody who went to Wimpy ever quite forgot. The bender in a bun, a frankfurter curled into a circle inside a round bun, dressed and served hot. It wasn't sophisticated. Nobody pretended it was. It looked slightly peculiar, if you're honest. This coiled sausage peering out from its bun like something that wasn't entirely sure it belonged there. But it was memorable in that odd, stubborn way that certain foods lodge in the brain long after the last taste has faded. People who haven't set foot in a Wimpy for 40 years can describe a bender in a bun without a moment's hesitation. They can tell you exactly how it looked on the plate, how it sat in the bun, what came on it. That's not mere nostalgia. That's flavor memory, deep and specific. And it tells you something about how thoroughly ordinary things can settle into a life when they're repeated enough. The real work, the hidden labor that kept the whole operation turning, happened in the spaces the customer wasn't meant to notice. Table service means carrying plates. Not one plate, carefully, but several at once, balanced on forearms and between fingers. Weaving through a room that's busy at lunchtime and unpredictable at tea time, and occasionally chaotic on a Saturday when every table fills at once and the queue backs up towards the door. It means clearing, reaching across to stack a plate on top of a plate, gathering cutlery into a bundle, scooping up bald napkins and empty sauce packets, balancing it all on one arm while wiping the table with the other, then resetting, clean cutlery, fresh napkin, now a menu back in its stand, before the next customer has finished hanging up their coat. It means washing up continuously, relentlessly, crockery, cutlery, glasses, milkshake tumblers, sauce dishes, teacups, saucers, all of it cycling through a cramped kitchen, through hot water and detergent and the steam of the drying rack, and back out again to the shelf, ready for the next sitting. The rhythm never stopped from opening to close. It only changed speed. The waitress had to balance pace with something that looked like calm. The grill cook had to read the orders coming in and judge the timing. This burger needs 2 more minutes. Those onions need turning. The chips are nearly ready. That milkshake order has been sitting for too long. And between them, a shift manager trying to keep the whole thing moving, watching the room, watching the kitchen, watching the clock, stepping in where the pressure was building. It was choreography, not the kind anyone would call graceful, but choreography nonetheless. A set of practiced movements repeated hundreds of times a day, and the skill lay in making none of it visible to the person sitting at the table, waiting for their plate. None of them were especially well paid for it. Exact Wimpy payroll records are patchy. Franchise operations rarely leave tidy wage archives, but the published benchmarks tell a clear enough story. In April 1973, Hansard recorded that median gross weekly earnings in licensed restaurants and hotels were £25 for men and £15.20 for women. Those figures sat well below the overall averages for full-time manual work that same year. Put through an inflation calculator, £1 in 1973 comes to roughly £15.70 in today's money, which means those weekly wages translate to about £393 and £239 respectively. Enough to pay the rent and keep the lights on, not enough to put anything aside. And the gap between the two figures, men earning nearly twice what women earned for work in the same industry, was not a statistical quirk. It was structural, embedded in the pay scales, in the job titles, in the assumptions about whose work was worth what. Nobody questioned it much at the time. That was simply how things were. The gendered split ran through the whole operation like a seam. Front-of-house service in British catering sat inside a heavily female tradition, inherited from Lyons, and the wider hospitality trade. The person who greeted you at the door, showed you to your table, took your order, brought your plate, topped up your tea, cleared your crockery, and smiled while doing all of it. Through the rush and the heat and the customers who were rude and the ones who lingered too long and the ones who left a mess, was, overwhelmingly, a woman. Kitchen and management roles were more mixed, but the visible face of a Wimpy bar, the one the customer dealt with and remembered, was female, and paid accordingly. The customers themselves were everyone and no one in particular. That was part of the trick, if you can call it a trick, and part of why Wimpy lasted as long as it did. Teenagers after school, pooling their pocket money for a milkshake and a shared portion of chips. Shoppers resting sore feet after a morning trailing through town. Families on a Saturday, the children already negotiating dessert terms before their coats were off. Football supporters wanting something hot and cheap before a 3 o'clock kickoff. Couples after the pictures, sitting across from each other in the warm, slightly oily hum of the room, drawing out the evening. Late-night workers in city centers wanting something solid before the last train. Grateful for anywhere that was still open and still warm and still serving food on a plate. Wimpy was cheap enough to be ordinary, branded enough to feel faintly modern, and it sat at a particular point in British life where eating out casually was still relatively unfamiliar. In early post-war Britain, eating in the street was faintly frowned upon. You didn't wander about with food in your hands, not if you had any self-respect, not in public, not where people could see. So the burger was domesticated. You sat down, or at least you paused. You used a knife and fork because that's what the cutlery was there for. You could have tea, coffee, pudding, and a proper chat. The sizzle of the grill and the quiet clink of metal on crockery mixed together in a way that felt right, to a country still working out what casual dining was supposed to look like. But it's worth pausing on one detail that complicates the picture, because this wasn't some democratic paradise where everyone was welcome on equal terms. In 1971, Empire Catering Limited, which ran some Wimpy franchises, enforced a policy of refusing to serve unaccompanied women after midnight, citing the Late Night Refreshment Houses Act. That policy drew protest, and rightly so. But its existence tells you something important about the world Wimpy occupied. The burger might have been American in origin, and that the rules about who could eat it and when and with whom and under what conditions were entirely restrictively, recognizably British. Wimpy was respectable, but respectability in that era came with conditions that look very different now. That was the world Wimpy built, and to grasp why it mattered, why it filled the space it filled, for as long as it did, as thoroughly as it did, you need to understand the gap in British life it was designed to occupy. Before the late 1970s fast food boom, Britain had relatively few cheap standardized places where an ordinary person could walk into a town center and get a hot, familiar meal without planning, without booking, and without spending much money. Think about that for a moment. The options were limited. The traditional greasy spoon cafe, the fish and chip shop, and the occasional Bernie Inn or steakhouse, a Lyons tea shop if one was nearby, and a scattering of local restaurants that varied wildly in price, quality, and welcome. Pubs served drink, not food, not in any serious way, not yet. Casual eating out, the kind where you just walked in off the street without a reservation or a plan, sat down and ordered something quick and recognizable, was not yet a fixed part of the national routine. Wimpy offered exactly that. It was American branding installed inside a British catering machine, and it worked because Lyons already understood, better than almost anyone, how to feed large numbers of people quickly, respectably, and without fuss. The employment structure grew more complex over time, and the complexity matters. In the early years, this was a corporate chain linked directly to J. Lyons, fed by Lyons' existing supply networks and staffed through Lyons' existing hiring practices. As ownership changed, and it would change several times, each change pulling the chain in a slightly different direction, the nature of the business shifted too, moving gradually away from direct corporate control and towards franchising. Today, Wimpy UK says all its restaurants are franchised, and trade bodies describe the remaining chain as 50-plus branches across England and Scotland. That matters because the story of Wimpy is partly a story about what happens when a mass national operation, something that once felt as permanent and as solid as the high street beneath it, contracts into a niche franchise network operating at the margins of British life. The technical explanation of how Wimpy worked is straightforward, but it's essential to everything that follows because it reveals exactly where the vulnerability lay. Traditional British Wimpy traded speed against comfort. Food was cooked in batches or to order, but service still involved people at every stage. A waitress taking the order, a cook working the grill, someone plating up, someone carrying the plate to the table, someone clearing afterwards, someone washing up, someone resetting. The room was designed for customers who might linger. A second cup of tea, a pudding, a conversation that ran 5 minutes longer than strictly necessary. That lingering was the appeal. It made Wimpy feel unhurried, neighborly, human. It was also, in strict business terms, dead time. Every table occupied by a customer who'd already paid was a table unavailable to a customer who hadn't. So fast food operators in Britain's later boom would design their operations around a different principle entirely. The target was to serve a customer at a counter within about 3 minutes of their entering the building. 3 minutes. No table, no waiting staff, no plate, no cutlery, no clearing, no washing up, disposable packaging, self-service seating, customer-cleared trays. That means fewer steps per transaction, fewer staff per shift, less floor space, tied up by seated customers who'd finished eating, faster turnover per square foot, and far easier standardization from one branch to the next. Once you understand that arithmetic, and it is arithmetic stripped of sentiment, nothing more romantic than throughput per hour, you understand why Wimpy's old strengths would eventually become expensive overhead. But before the arithmetic turned, Wimpy had its years of genuine, unchallenged dominance. By 1970, the company said it had more than 1,000 restaurants across 23 countries. In Britain alone, retrospective accounts consistently place the estate at well over 500 branches at its peak, 500 Wimpy bars scattered across the length and breadth of the country, in London, in Manchester, in Glasgow, in Cardiff, in Plymouth, in Nottingham, in Northampton, in towns you'd struggle to find on a map without squinting. That's a Wimpy in virtually every significant town and city center in Britain. Not a curiosity, not something you had to seek out. A fixture, as ordinary, as unremarkable, as expected as the boots next door or the bus shelter across the road. Culturally, on this was the high water mark of something quite specific. The hamburger made safe for a country that still wasn't entirely comfortable with American informality. Wimpy managed to be modern without being threatening. The branding carried a whiff of the transatlantic, which gave it a certain glamour. But the experience, the table, the cutlery, the tea, the pudding, was unmistakably British. Teenagers felt it was theirs. Their parents felt it was acceptable. Their grandparents could walk in without embarrassment. The bender in a bun sat alongside tea and the brown derby on the same menu, and nobody thought that combination odd because Wimpy had spent 2 decades making it ordinary. It wasn't trying to be California. It was the British high street with burgers, and it wore that identity without apology. This is the moment to hold in mind, because it makes everything that follows land properly. Seeing a Wimpy on the high street was unremarkable. You didn't point it out. You didn't mention it. It was simply part of how British towns were furnished, part of the wallpaper of urban life. The red and yellow signage, the warmth visible through the steamed-up glass on a cold afternoon, the smell of fried onions drifting out whenever someone pushed open the door. It was just there, the way a pillar box is just there, or a zebra crossing, or the number 42 bus. Then, in October 1974, McDonald's opened its first British restaurant in Woolwich, southeast London. And what arrived was not simply another burger chain with a different logo. It was a different operating system altogether. Precision matters here, because the common version of this story, McDonald's appeared, Wimpy crumbled, end of an is too neat and too kind to the complexity of what actually happened. McDonald's didn't win because it was American and shiny, and backed by bigger money, although all of those things helped. It won because it represented a fundamentally different way of organizing the sale of a hamburger. The difference wasn't cosmetic. It ran through every stage of the operation, from the moment a customer entered the building to the moment they left. At Wimpy, you sat down. Someone came to you. Your food arrived on a warm plate, with cutlery, on a table that had been set for you. You ate at your own pace. You could have pudding. You could have tea. When you left, a person cleared your table, carried your crockery to the kitchen, washed it, dried it, stacked it, and reset the table with clean cutlery and a fresh napkin. Every one of those steps required a human being, and every human being required a wage, a break, a sick day, a holiday, a rota slot, a share of the overheads. At McDonald's, you queued at a counter. You ordered from a numbered menu displayed on a lit board above the till. Your food arrived in paper wrapping, inside a paper bag within minutes. You carried it yourself to a seat, if you chose to sit at all. Increasingly, people didn't. They ate walking down the street, or on the bus, or sitting on a bench, or standing outside the shop because nobody was telling them not to, and the packaging was designed for exactly that. When you finished, you put your rubbish in a bin. Nobody cleared. Nobody washed a plate. Nobody reset a table. The customer performed half the service labor that Wimpy was paying trained staff to carry out, and the business banked the difference. The economic implications were not subtle, and they compounded with every branch McDonald's opened. Wimpy's table service format carried labor costs at every stage. Waiting staff, clearers, porters, washers up, the constant replacement of crockery and cutlery that chipped and bent and went missing, and slower customer turnover because the room was designed for sitting and lingering. McDonald's counter service system, built around disposable packaging and a rigid timed, almost industrial production line behind the counter, made speed itself the product. Fewer staff tasks per customer served, faster throughput per hour, higher volume from the same square footage, tighter managerial control over every stage of the process, from the size of the portion to the temperature of the oil to the number of seconds a burger spent on the grill. For the customer, this meant less ceremony and less sitting down, less of a meal perhaps, and more of a transaction. For the business, it meant more people served per hour from the same patch of rented floor. And once British consumers got used to the new rhythm, once they learned to queue rather than wait, to carry rather than be served, to unwrap rather than use a knife and fork, to eat and go rather than eat and stay. Wimpy's older model began to look slow rather than civilized. Its strengths became friction. Its charm became overhead. McDonald's scaled with extraordinary, almost relentless speed. One restaurant in 1974, 100 by 1983, 200 by 1986, 300 by 1988, 400 by 1991. And it kept going, past 500, past 1,000, eventually past 1,200. That is a rate of expansion that doesn't just serve demand, it reshapes it. 100 branches of something is a novelty you might seek out on a trip to London. 400 is a fact of life you barely register. And once the new model became normal, once queuing at a counter for a wrapped burger in a paper bag was simply what getting a burger meant in Britain, the old model was in serious, structural trouble. The broader economic context sharpened every pressure. The 1970s were brutal in Britain. Inflation surged to levels that eroded wages and savings alike. Unemployment climbed to post-war highs. The country endured strike action, energy crises, and prolonged recessionary strain that squeezed household budgets and business margins in equal measure. Like in that environment, any restaurant chain had every incentive to chase tighter costs, simpler systems, faster turnover, fewer staff per shift, and anything else that kept the numbers from turning hostile. The economics were pushing hard in one direction, and it wasn't towards table service, crockery, and a waitress asking if you'd like another cup of tea. Then came the corporate turning point that broke the chain apart. Wimpy had passed from J. Lyons to United Biscuits in 1977. Through the 1980s, the chain was already losing ground, branch by branch, lease by lease, year by year. By the time Grand Metropolitan acquired the business in 1989, the UK estate had fallen to 381 sites, down from that peak of well over 500. Grand Met already owned Burger King, and what happened next was governed by commercial logic so cold it barely needs explaining. The counter service Wimpy branches, the ones that had already adapted away from the old table service format and were operating more like conventional fast food outlets, were converted to Burger King. New signage, new branding, new system. The remaining table service restaurants, the ones still doing it the old way, still carrying plates and washing crockery and setting cutlery at each place, were separated out in a management buyout in 1990. The old Wimpy estate was literally divided according to which operating model still had a commercial future. The counter service half got absorbed into an American brand. The table service half got independence, but at a fraction of its former scale and without the backing of a major corporation. It was not a death, exactly, but it was the moment Wimpy stopped being a national chain in any meaningful sense and became something smaller, more fragile, more dependent on the commitment of individual franchise owners in individual towns. What followed was not dramatic. That's the thing about a long fade. It doesn't announce itself. It just happens, quietly, over years. When Famous Brands, a South African restaurant group, bought Wimpy UK in 2007, the business still comprised 194 outlets across England, Scotland, and Wales, plus 20 more in Ireland under license. 194, reduced certainly, diminished from the old days, undeniably, but still present, still trading, still putting burgers on plates with fried onions and a squeeze from the plastic tomato. The years since tell a steeper story. A more recent trade and press sources place the current UK estate at just over 50 branches, perhaps around 60 depending on the source and the date you check. From over 500 to around 60, not overnight, not in a single crisis or a single corporate decision. Over decades, branch by branch, lease expiry by lease expiry, retirement by retirement, one more shuttered frontage on one more high street. The kind of fade that happens so gradually that most people don't register it until they suddenly realize they haven't seen a Wimpy in years, and then they can't quite remember when they last did. The geography of the survivors tells its own quiet story. The remaining Wimpys are often no longer on the most prominent stretches of the old high street, not sandwiched between Woolworths and the Odeon anymore. Because Woolworths is gone too, and half the Odeons have become bingo halls or flats. They're in smaller towns, suburban pockets, transport-adjacent spots, Seaside places, Clacton, Felixstowe, Southsea, the kinds of locations where the pace of commercial change runs a little slower. The rents are a little kinder, and a familiar brand still carries some warmth with the locals who remember it. Wimpy became the kind of thing you noticed with a jolt. There's still one here. You'd say it the way you'd say it about a red telephone box that still had a working phone inside, or a greengrocer that hadn't yet become a Tesco Express. Not quite disbelief, more a small, sharp prick of recognition that something you'd filed under gone was still quietly, determinedly hanging on. Surviving not because it was thriving, but because someone, somewhere, cared enough to keep the grill hot and the door open. And the workers? The waitresses who'd carried plates through lunch rushes for years? The grill cooks who could time a burger by feel? The shift managers who'd kept rooms turning over 6 days a week? The franchisees who'd built their livelihoods, their mortgages, their family routines around a brand that once seemed as permanent as the pavement? In broad terms, retirement, redundancy, transfer to other chains, retraining in other trades, or continuation under franchise ownership in the diminished network. The skills didn't all vanish. People who know how to run a kitchen, manage a room, time a rush, and keep 20 tables content don't forget how to do it. Those abilities travel. But they cease to be central to the main current of British fast food. The waitress carrying 4 plates through a crowded room gave way to the crew member assembling wrapped orders at a lit counter. The grill cook timing burgers by instinct and experience gave way to a production system designed to make instinct unnecessary, where a timer beeped and a light flashed, and the process governed the person rather than the other way round. The burger survived, identical in principle, beef in a bun. The arrangement of human labor around it changed beyond recognition. What was lost was not just a brand name or a logo on a high street frontage. It was a distinct British compromise between café culture and fast food, a thing that existed nowhere else quite like it existed here. A place where a burger could arrive as part of a small, repeatable ritual. A table, a plate, fried onions done properly on the flat top, pudding afterwards if you fancied it, a cup of tea with the bag left in, and maybe a waitress who half recognized you because you came in every Saturday after the shopping. She didn't know your name, necessarily, but she knew your order, or near enough. She knew you liked your tea strong and your onions well done. And that small familiarity, not friendship, nothing so grand as that, just recognition, just a nod that said the usual, was part of what the place offered, built into the price of the meal without appearing on the bill. Behind that ritual sat a form of service work that demanded more invisible skill than it ever received credit for. Pace, knowing when to approach a table and when to hold back, reading the room the way a conductor reads an orchestra. A memory, 3 tables orders held in the head while the 4th was still deciding, and the kitchen was backed up and the hatch was calling. Carrying soi, 4 plates balanced between 2 hands and 2 forearms, none of them touching, none of them tilting, none of them cold by the time they reached the table on the far side of the room. Clearing, swift and unobtrusive, reaching across without crowding, stacking without clattering, leaving the table ready for the next customer before they'd even noticed the last one had gone. And underneath all of it, the constant, invisible work of timing, keeping 20 tables turning over steadily, each one at a different stage of its meal, without anyone feeling rushed and without anyone waiting too long. Keeping the whole room moving like a slow, orderly current, even when the milkshake machine was on the blink and the grill cook was running 10 minutes behind and a party of 8 had just walked in without warning. That was real, practiced, hard-won skill. It just didn't look like skill to most people who sat there, because the whole point of doing it well was making it look effortless. What was gained should be acknowledged just as plainly, because fairness matters more than sentiment, and the audience deserves both sides of the ledger. The newer system brought speed, standardization, consistency, lower friction for the customer, and far greater national reach. McDonald's growth tells its own story in numbers that are difficult to argue with. By the time the company marked 50 years in Britain, it reported around 1,435 UK restaurants, serving almost 4 million customers a day, on with more than 171,000 people employed across company and franchise operations. Even the lower figures on its standard UK history page put the estate at more than 1,270 restaurants and 120,000 employees. That is a scale of feeding people, quickly, predictably, and at a price that required almost no thought, that the old Wimpy model with its crockery and its clearing, and its cups of tea and its washing up and its waitresses who recognized regulars, could never have achieved. Not because the people inside Wimpy weren't good enough, because the system wasn't built for that kind of volume. The newer system was. And the newer system won. The larger pattern is not hard to see once you step back far enough to take it in. This is not just a burger story, it's a British story about a certain kind of post-war respectability. Careful, mannered. I still half attached to the conviction that eating out ought to involve sitting down and using proper implements. Giving way to something more standardized, more global, more ruthlessly efficient. About labor-heavy service models yielding to systems designed around throughput, speed, and control. About the high street itself becoming less local in its texture and more uniform in its operation, one chain replacing another, one familiar face behind a counter giving way to a system that didn't depend on any particular face at all. Wimpy's decline fits the same broad shape as a great many vanished or diminished British trades. The work doesn't always disappear because nobody values it, but because a different system can do the same task faster, at lower cost, and at a scale the old way was never built to match. So come back, one last time, just to that table. The formica surface, wiped clean and still faintly damp. The knife and fork set neatly on a paper napkin. The plate, warm from the kitchen, with a burger that isn't trying to be anything other than what it is. The onions, dark and sweet from the flat top. The chips, hot, slightly too salty, exactly right. The plastic tomato, red and sticky around the cap, full of ketchup, ready to dribble. A cup of tea in its saucer, the bag still in, a small brown ring where the spoon rested. And somewhere behind the counter, out of sight, the quiet clatter of crockery being stacked, the hiss of the flat-top grill being scraped clean, and the sound of a tap running over a sink full of plates that will need to be washed, dried, stacked, and sent back out before the next wave arrives. The room is warm. The windows are steamed at the edges. Outside, the high street is doing what the high street does. Buses, shoppers, prams, pigeons. And inside, for a little while longer, a burger arrives on a plate, carried by a woman who does this 100 times a day and makes it look like nothing at all. Britain still has burgers everywhere. More places selling them now than at any point in the country's history, probably. What it mostly no longer has is this particular version of them. Slower, more local, a bit odd, a bit old-fashioned. Completely ordinary in its day. Wimpy didn't vanish because people stopped wanting to eat. It lost because Britain changed the way it wanted eating to work. The counter replaced the table. The wrapper replaced the plate. The system replaced the person. The transaction replaced the ritual. And once that change had settled in, once it had become so normal that most people couldn't remember there'd ever been another way, the old burger bar, warm and cluttered and slightly sticky and imperfect and familiar, became something you remembered rather than something you simply walked into on any high street in the country. Did you go to Wimpy when it was still on your high street? Did your local one keep table service right to the end? Or had it already switched to counters by the time you stopped going? Were you a bender and a bun person? Or did you go straight for the brown derby? And do you remember the plastic tomato, the one that always dribbled?